The spiritual strivings of the freedman's sons is the travel of souls, whose burden is almost among the measure of their strength, and who is buried in this name of an historic race, in the name of the land of their fathers' fathers, in the name of human opportunity. W.E.B. Du Bois, the souls of black folks. Welcome to One Mic, a Black History podcast. I'm your host, Country Boy. And this episode is about the Great Migration. The Great Migration is an exodus out of the Jim Crow South for African Americans to the industrialized North. As always, if you like this, you enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page and review us on Apple Podcasts. Also, listen to the Cut Podcast for all your Black culture needs. In 1910, it was almost 8 million blacks living in the United States. And of those 8 million blacks, 7 million of them lived in the South. Over the next 30 years, 1.5 million blacks migrated from the South to the North in what would be the greatest internal migration in United States history. They left to locate better jobs and housing and increased educational opportunities. The corrosive Jim Crow laws of the South made the choice easy to move north in an attempt to claim the American dream. The first black migrants made their way north in 1910. They primarily headed to cities in the Northeast. They settled in major industrial areas like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, New York, and Philadelphia. During the time period of the black exodus from the South, from 1910 to 1930, the African American population in Detroit grew from just 6,000 to over 120,000, and New York tripled from 100,000 to 328,000 African Americans. African Americans were not the only ones to migrate in mass. A great stream of Europeans also immigrated to the United States. From 1870 to 1925, 25 million European immigrants settled in the United States. This was only started to wane during the start of World War I. This was due to a large number of European men entering the military and the wave of anti-immigrant sentiment that started here in the United States. This led to Congress passing laws to further reduce the flow of immigrants in this country. The war effort during World War I led to increased demand for industrial products made in the North, but they were without the European immigrants that they had been using. So this left many industries without an adequate supply of unskilled laborers. This led the manufacturers to replenish their workforce with Southern blacks. Northern companies offered well-paying jobs, free transportation, low-cost housing as inducements to blacks moving north. The labor agents would receive a fee for every recruit they provided the company, and some labor agents would just stand on street corners in the South and sell the idea of a better life to an eager, captive audience. And while most of the jobs in the North were unskilled positions, they paid laborers more than they could ever receive in the South. In the North during World War I, the average pay was $3 to $4 a day, while in the South, most sharecroppers only averaged 75 cents to $1 a day. One of the most interesting aspects of the Great Migration is that it was pretty much a leaderless movement. Individual blacks weighed the possibilities of settling in the North versus their prospect of staying in the South long term. Jim Crow limited everything in their life: their housing, their jobs, how much they could make, their education, and their ability to vote and change their circumstances. African Americans in the North faced intolerable social situation under Jim Crow, while the North provided opportunities and basic civil rights. The migration was not that unsimilar to other migrations of refugees escaping famine or war or genocide in other parts of the world, traveling long distances in the hopes of a better life. The main routes of the Great Migration followed railway lines from points in the South to specific industrial centers in the North. For instance, the Illinois Central Railroad sent blacks from Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee to Chicago and other nearby cities like Detroit and Cleveland. The East Coast Seaboard Line sent blacks from Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Once companies stopped covering travel expenses, it became very expensive to travel from the South to the North. Blacks would struggle to come up with the money, and the growing demand for railroad travel, railroads increased their prices. And in 1915, it only cost 2 cents a mile to travel by railway. But by 1918, it cost over 24 cents a mile. As a result, black families would often have to save for their fare, selling their belongings, or sending only one family member at a time. Other families would attempt to travel in stages, often stopping for work and raising money so they could continue their journey. In addition to the cost of traveling, black families had to migrate in secret. They feared reprisals from Southerners in local communities, so they would slip away in the middle of the night. And they had good reason to worry. Some whites in the South were shocked at the size and scope of the migration and were livid at the loss of cheap labor. So they pulled migrating blacks off trains and off buses and beat them and put them in jail. Labor agents were fined and local leaders attempted to keep them from black communities. While all this was happening, the Southern media attempted to paint a rosy picture of black life in the South. One headline from the Commercial Appeal of Memphis read, "South better for the Negro," says Mississippian, "colored people found to be prosperous and happy." This indicates that white Southerners understood the impact that the migration would have on their livelihood and the economy in their local communities, but exposed their inability to understand how blacks in these communities felt about their circumstances. Had white Southerners been reading the Chicago Defender, the leading black paper at the time, they would have understood the circumstances of blacks in the South. The Chicago Defender was founded in 1905 by Robert S. Abbott. He was a big advocate of migration of blacks to the North and Chicago specifically. Abbott used an informal system of Pullman porters and entertainers to distribute their paper beyond Chicago to readers in the South. The Defender promoted Chicago as an attractive destination for Southern blacks, calling it the Promised Land. And the Defender also made the correlation of the plight of African Americans in the South to Jews being held in bondage in ancient Egypt. They also called the Great Migration the flight out of Egypt. As a Northern paper, the Defender had freedom to denounce issues outright. Its editorial position was to attack racial equality head on. Blacks would use the Defender to assure themselves that migrating blacks would be welcome in northern cities, or at least more welcome than they were in the South. The Defender was one of the first newspapers to describe the racial hatred that blacks felt in the South and played a major role in influencing the Great Migration to urban areas. And the paper advertised the success of black individuals as inspiration to move. The Defender also featured job listings, train schedules that were posted to help facilitate relocation. The Defender also would post editorials, cartoons, and articles to attract attention to the movement. In January of 1917, they published an article on why they leave the South and outlined all the lynchings that happened in the South by state with a vivid description of their death. The Defender also featured letters and poetry submitted by successful recent migrants. Southern blacks wrote letters to the Defender looking for information about jobs and housing and just general life in Chicago. One of these letters published in the Defender in 1917 was an anonymous poem called Bound for the Promised Land, which captured the disposition of blacks in the South. Why should I remain any longer in the South to be kicked and dogged around? Crackers shoot me in the mouth, shoot my brother down. I'd rather the cold snatch my breath and die from natural cause than to stay in the South and be beat to death under cracker law. The Defender was an advocate for the Great Migration and against racism, and so incensed Southern politicians and local officials that the paper had to be smuggled into the South. White distributors refused to circulate the Defender, and local police would confiscate any copies they found. Some places the publication was completely banned. One town in Mississippi called the Defender German propaganda, which is in line with the anti-German sentiment post-World War I. All of these actions to stop the Defender was basically unsuccessful because the Defender was the most read and most influential black paper in the country at the time. It was estimated at its height, every paper sold was read by 4 to 5 African Americans, putting its readership at over 500,000 people a week. During this exodus, African American organizations formed to help aid black migrants in the challenges that they faced in their new urban environment. And the most popular of those organizations was the NAACP. Just as the Chicago Defender was their main news source for migrating blacks, the NAACP became their primary civil rights organization. It was founded in 1909 and in response to racial injustice and offered legal and economic help to migrating blacks. The NAACP fought against restrictive covenants preventing blacks from moving into white neighborhoods and lobbied against school segregation in northern cities. They also lobbied unsuccessfully for a federal anti-lynching bill. The NAACP even featured a magazine called The Crisis, which also fought racism and racist policies in both the North and the South. And by April of 1919, the NAACP had grown from 9,000 members to 51,000 members and had a dozen chapters all over the country. The Crisis was also circulated to almost 100,000 readers. Chicago and the North in general was far from a promised land. The Great Migration triggered a housing shortage in almost every major urban center. This crisis was made even worse for blacks because of segregationist policies. Although segregation in the North was not specifically defined by law like it was in the South, as blacks poured in to the North, angry groups of whites from all major cities lobbied for laws to prohibit landowners from renting to blacks in their neighborhoods. Another method they would use was restrictive covenant clauses in mortgage agreements that homeowners could only sell to a specific minority. All of these were a powerful force of racial discrimination, and some of these covenants were even endured in states into the 1960s. Housing shortages and discriminatory policies, along with neighborhood pressure not to sell or rent to blacks, left black families with very few options for housing. So they congested into poor neighborhoods with overpriced rent. Landlords frequently took full advantages of the housing shortages to charge exorbitant rent to black migrants. The high cost of housing forced blacks to share tiny apartments with friends and relatives. Some apartments became so overcrowded, migrants had to share a bed with one person sleeping while the other person would work. As the migration grew, blacks would migrate in patterns, moving to specific areas in the North, settling in neighborhoods where they had family and friends, or with areas with a strong black communities. Some places in Chicago had neighborhoods that were populated with people all from the same southern town. As a positive result of these housing tensions, many blacks ended up creating their own cities within big cities, fostering an explosion of African American culture. The most prominent example was in Harlem. A formerly all-white neighborhood by the 1920s housed over 200,000 African Americans. The birth of the Harlem Renaissance was a direct result of mass migration of African Americans. The Harlem Renaissance was one of the most influential intellectual, social, artistic movements of the 20th century. New York was a major destination for migrating blacks, and Harlem was their overwhelming area of choice within New York. Attracting Southern blacks seeking work, it also attracted educated blacks who made this an area a center of culture. Harlem was originally developed in the 19th century as an exclusive suburb for white middle to upper middle classes. Its affluent beginnings led to the development of stately houses, grand avenues, and world-class amenities like the Harlem Opera House. During an enormous influx of European migrants in the late 19th century, the once exclusive district was abandoned by the white middle class who moved farther north in New York City. The music of choice in Harlem during the 1920s was often played in speakeasies offering illegal liquor. Jazz became a great draw not only to Harlem residents, but to an outside white audience because it became very fashionable to frequent the Harlem nightlife. Businessmen quickly realized that white people wanted to experience black culture without actually having to socialize with African Americans, so they created clubs that catered specifically to them. One of the most successful of those clubs was the Cotton Club, which featured frequent performances by musicians like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. Some in the community derided even the existence of such clubs, but others believed that this was a sign that black culture was moving towards racial acceptance. The visual arts was never that welcoming to black artists. Art schools and galleries and museums would shut them off, but in Harlem, they found acceptance. The Harlem Renaissance was a golden age for African American visual artists, writers, musicians, and actors. They were able to take their lives as blacks and experiences slavery and segregation and just daily life in Harlem as inspiration for creation of amazing work. The Harlem Renaissance brought the black experience to the American public, and the explosion of culture and the legacy in Harlem Renaissance changed how America and the world viewed African Americans. And when blacks arrived in their northern destination, they were often met with resistance and hostility in the form of immigrants who already lived in these cities. These immigrants made up almost 25% of the nation's workforce. So as blacks applied for jobs in industries dominated by these immigrants, those immigrants perceived the black migrants as a potential threat to their livelihood. They saw black migrants as alien invaders who needed to be contained by a group who wasn't faring that much better than they were. These two groups were competing for the same low-skilled jobs. Businesses quickly learned that Southern blacks were willing to work for lower wages. They undercut the earnings of immigrants, and factory workers learned that they could pit the two groups against each other for wages, and this caused major anger and resentment amongst the immigrants. Black migrants always had a complicated relationship with labor unions. Major labor unions had accepted immigrants into their membership, but they had banned black migrants from joining. This overwhelmingly caused majority of black workers not to be unionized. This stance often worked to the advantage of management because blacks were excluded from working in unions. They would often hire them as strikebreakers. Blacks' role as strikebreakers further contributed to tensions with the immigrant white workers. And by 1919, industrial unions attempted to mend their relationship with migrating blacks by attempting to remove the color barrier. But nothing came of this because the message was clear that blacks didn't trust the unions and the unions didn't trust the blacks. As the black population in northern cities grew, racial discrimination intensified, and white anger and anxiety over this influx led to violence in increased frequency. This violence turned into the Red Summer, which is a series of race riots in cities all over the nation. I documented these events more in depth in episode 3 of the Red Summer, but the increased competition for jobs and housing amongst European immigrants and black migrants directly led to the violence of the Red Summer in several major cities like Chicago, where 38 people were killed and 500 more were seriously injured, with over 1,000 being left homeless. In the aftermath of the riots, The Chicago Commission on Race Relations found positivity amongst African Americans. The commission conducted extensive interviews with black immigrants, and they found that despite the issues prompted by the riots, blacks in Chicago were still overwhelmingly satisfied with their lives in the North. They were able to find jobs, and they were making more money, and they felt like even after the 1919 riots, they had more freedom from white oppression in Chicago than they ever had in the Jim Crow South. They expressed optimism over their northern future, and although they still face segregation in housing and limitations for jobs in northern cities, one area where they were equal was they had the ability to vote. The arrival of black workers changed the political landscape in the North. One of the first things that blacks did upon arriving in the North was register to vote, a civil right that had been virtually impossible to them in the South. African Americans became the majority in many urban districts because they did not face the same voter restrictions they faced in the South. The ultimate decline of the first Great Migration was the Great Depression of 1929. The U.S. stock market crashed and the economic crisis known as the Great Migration happened. 1/4 of the population lost their jobs. Blacks were especially hard hit by this crushing economic downturn. And by 1932, 56% of the black population was unemployed compared to only 28% of the white population. The Great Depression wiped out many job opportunities in the industrial North, and for African Americans, it caused a sharp decline in their migration. It wasn't until 1939 and the start of World War II that was the stage set for the second migration. Of course, this is a story for another day on this podcast. But African American migrants seeked a better social and economic opportunities. Many blacks were not able to escape racism by migrating north, and African Americans were segregated into ghettos, and urban life introduced new challenges that they didn't face in the South. But despite these disappointments and challenges, millions of African Americans were still able to build a better life for themselves and their families in the North. Jobs were more plentiful, education opportunities were more plentiful, and they were able to build a stable middle class of their own. While the Great Migration was a leaderless movement, African Americans found that they were stronger as a united front, a new era of political activism amongst African Americans who disenfranchisement in the South, but found a new place for themselves in public life and their ability to change their circumstances. Thank you. This has been One Mic. I was your host, Country Boy. Once again, if you like this, you enjoyed this, please consider donating to my Patreon page so I can continue to bring you dope content. Please review us on Apple Podcasts and check out The Cut for all of your black culture needs. And peace.